Hello, for those just watching this module, we are working through the Form PI1 General Application, or the PI1. In this module, I'll be showing you how to fill out the workbook for flexible permit applications. I will only be showing features different for flexible permits, mainly on the unit types emission rates sheet and the flex permits sheet. I recommend watching the other modules for detailed instructions on the other sheets, as well as more examples for completing the unit types emission rate sheet for scenarios you may have within your flexible permit. To start, I'll select an amendment here as my action type for the flexible permit entry. For this demonstration, I'm now going to jump ahead to the example sheet. There is a flexible permit example here that I'll just point out is a good resource to start. Next, we'll move to the unit types emission rate sheet. We've included specific instructions for flexible permits here. I do recommend reading those instructions specifically. As always, when completing this sheet, I'll start out by selecting my industry type using this drop-down. In this example, I'm selecting chemical and energy. I'll now give you a summary of what this permit is authorizing, the changes requested with this project, and then walk through how to enter each of them on this sheet. In this example permit, I have a couple of turbines, several tanks, and a flare. The tanks are all routed to the flare. This permit has an annual Nox cap for the turbines and an hourly and annual H2s cap for the tanks. With this project, I am modifying turbine 2, tank 1 through tank 4, and increasing the ton per year emission rates. Because the emissions routed to the flare from the tanks is increasing, the flare's emission rates are also increasing. I'm also increasing the Nox and H2s caps to account for these changes. Now we'll walk through how to enter each of those units and propose changes. First, we have turbine 1. I've indicated that it is not new or modified since it is not changing with this project. I've entered my list of pollutants and my emission rates, my current emission rates and my proposed emission rates. Since the Nox annual emissions are included in the cap, I left the cells blank for both the current emission rate here and for the proposed emission rate here. I entered emission rates for all other pollutants. Next is turbine 2. This turbine is being modified with this project, as indicated here. Just like turbine 1, I entered the pollutants and the emission rates, leaving the Nox annual emissions empty for both the current and the proposed cells. This time, I have higher proposed annual emissions, and the change is shown here. Next, I entered my 4 tanks. I am modifying tank 1, as indicated here. The tank is routed to a flare, as listed here. And I've listed the pollutants here. I've entered the current and proposed VOC emission rates here and here. And I've left the H2s emission rates blank, since those are included in the cap. One for short-term and one for long-term. Note, I entered higher proposed emission rates, and the change was calculated here. Tank 2, 3, and 4 are all entered the same way. VOC emission rates are listed, and H2s emission rates are left blank. All of the tanks are routed to the flare, listed here. The flare has higher emission rates and is modified, as indicated here. The flare is not included in any of the caps, so all of the emission rates are listed for both the current and proposed emissions. Finally, I have entered my 2 caps. First, there is the H2s cap. There are entries for both the short-term and long-term current emissions, as well as the short-term and long-term proposed emissions. And last is the Nox Annual Cap. It is modified with this project, and I entered the pollutant, Nox, and the current annual cap, and the proposed annual cap. Notice that I left the short-term columns empty since this cap does not have a short-term cap. Notice I entered yes in column B for all of the sources in this example. This column indicates whether or not to include the ton per year emission rates from each source in the project emission summary. There are several examples of when this should be no, such as multiple operating scenarios or caps not included in a flexible permit. These are covered in more detail in the unit type emission rate sheet module, and there are examples on the example sheet. For each source, I also indicated the unit type in this column. In summary for this sheet, be sure to list all units in the permit separately, even if they are in a cap. Select the unit type for each. Enter emission rates that are not in a cap, and leave blank those emission rates that are in a cap, and create a separate entry for each cap in the permit. We will now move to the flexible permits sheet. We developed this sheet to list cap contributions of each source in the cap. The sheet allows for 8 different caps for 4 different scenarios: normal pound per hour, normal ton per year, MSS pound per hour, and MSS ton per year. So there are many columns across for this sheet. The first step is to freeze the pane to maximize your viewing window. This is optional, but we think it makes using the sheet much more convenient. First, I scroll down until the instructions are no longer visible. Then I select this cell, and I can freeze the viewing area by selecting View, Freeze Panes, Freeze Panes. Note, this may look different if you're using a different version of Excel. Now, when I scroll down or over, my fin list stays and my headings stay. Okay, we are now ready to start entering data. You'll notice that all of the fins entered on the unit type emission rate sheet are now listed on this sheet, as well as their associated EPNs and source names. For each fin, I've indicated whether or not any pollutant from that fin is included in the cap in this column. For the turbines, the answer is yes, since their annual Nox emissions are in a cap. For the tanks, the answer is yes, since their H2s emissions are in both short-term and long-term caps. For the flare, I entered no, since the flare emissions are not included in a cap. And the last 2 entries are the caps themselves. Since they are listed as fins on the unit type emission rate sheet, they are pulled onto this sheet. However, no data is needed on this sheet, so I selected no for each of them. Next, I will use this drop-down to select H2s, my first normal operation pound per hour cap pollutant. The drop-down list contains commonly seen capped pollutants, but you can also type in any pollutant needed in this cell. As you can see, this cap has 3 columns, one to enter the current contribution, one to enter the proposed contribution, and one that automatically calculates the change. I already filled in these values for each of the sources in our example. Here we have a row with the totals, which sums the entries in that column. The values in this row should match the entries for the caps on the unit type's emission rate sheet. Next, I will scroll over to our normal operation ton per year cap section. Here, I will again enter H2s. I already entered the emission rates for this example. As you can see, I entered the current proposed, and the change was automatically calculated for me. The values were included in the total row here, and they match my entries on the unit type's emission rate sheet. And the same thing for the Nox cap here. The other sheets should be completed as presented in the other modules. Please note, the caps you listed on the unit type's emission rate sheet will be listed on the stack parameters, the BACT, and monitoring sheets, just like how they were entered here on the flexible permit sheet. You do not need to enter any data for the cap, fin, or EPN on these sheets. For example, here you can see that we have the caps listed on the stack parameters sheet. You can just leave those entries blank.